In recent years, the immigration system in the United States has become a stage for growing confusion, emotional unrest, and stark contradictions. With evolving border policies, conflicting judicial rulings, and intensified enforcement efforts, immigrant communities live under an increasingly heavy shadow of uncertainty. At the heart of this climate lies ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, whose mission and methods have drawn fierce public scrutiny. From early morning home raids to surprise detentions in public spaces, the organization's tactics often provoke both fear and moral outrage. The streets of cities like El Paso, Los Angeles, and Chicago echo with whispered warnings. Mothers hesitate before walking their children to school. Fathers skip critical medical appointments. Teenagers fear stepping outside to play soccer in the park. It's not just about the legality of immigration anymore. It's about the fear of being seen, of being noticed, of being next. For many, daily life resembles a kind of silent emergency. The psychological weight of this fear doesn't just weigh on undocumented individuals. It reverberates across families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. And yet, amid the statistics and sweeping policies, what often gets lost are the deeply human moments, fragile, raw, and telling. Moments where the line between enforcement and inhumanity begins to blur. ICE operations, frequently justified under the umbrella of national security and legal enforcement, sometimes unfold with a brutality that raises serious ethical questions. How far can we go in the name of law before we lose sight of humanity? It is within this uneasy atmosphere that one story cuts through the noise, not because of its sensationalism, but because of its simplicity. A woman, pregnant and undocumented, finds herself in ICE custody. What follows is not a clash of ideologies or a courtroom drama. It is a silent collapse. A human body, vulnerable, exhausted, ignored, giving in under the weight of a system too indifferent to notice. This is not an isolated case, and it is not an accident. It is part of a larger pattern, a chilling normalization of neglect cloaked in legal procedure. The question is no longer whether something went wrong, but why it keeps happening. The story begins right here. It happened in a holding facility just outside of Bakersfield, California. A makeshift detention center operated by ICE, the site was previously a logistics warehouse hastily retrofitted to process a rising number of immigrant detainees. On paper, it was categorized as a short-term processing location, meant to hold individuals for no more than 72 hours before transfer or release. In practice, people were often kept there for days, sometimes weeks, top, under crowded and deteriorating conditions. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead 24 hours a day. There were no beds, only cement benches and metallic space blankets. The air was stale, and the temperature was kept uncomfortably cold, regardless of the outside heat. That's where Maria, name changed for safety, was brought after a workplace raid at a food packing facility. 6 months pregnant, she was arrested in front of coworkers and escorted out with her hands zip-tied in front of her stomach. Maria had no criminal record, no pending warrants, and had lived quietly in California for over a decade. Her only offense was overstaying her visa, a civil infraction, not a criminal act. Still, she was processed like a felon. The intake officer reportedly made no note of her pregnancy, and Maria was given no prenatal care during her time at the facility. No additional blankets, no additional food, no access to a medical professional trained in maternal health. What she was given, like everyone else, was a foil blanket, a mat on the concrete floor, and a number. Over the next 48 hours, Maria began to feel lightheaded. She mentioned dizziness to a guard, but her words, spoken in Spanish, were dismissed or misunderstood. On the third day, she fainted during a head count. Her body hit the concrete with a thud loud enough to cause others in the holding room to scream. It took 9 minutes before any medical attention arrived. When ICE later released a brief statement, they described the incident as medically non-life-threatening and handled according to protocol. There was no mention of Maria's name, her pregnancy, or the conditions leading up to her collapse. To them, it was a minor event, a logistical hiccup. But to those who were there, it was something else entirely. It was the moment a system stopped pretending to care. Maria's story doesn't begin in a detention center. It begins in a small village outside of Oaxaca, Mexico, where her life was quiet, honest, and rooted in family. When cartel violence crept into her community and local police failed to intervene, she fled north with nothing but a duffel bag, a cross on a chain, and a heart full of fear. At 22, she crossed the border, undocumented but determined, joining her cousin in California. She found work cleaning motel rooms, then at a produce packing plant. She sent money home every month. She never missed a shift. She obeyed the law, stayed invisible, and lived for the dream of one day seeing her siblings safe again. By the time Maria met Roberto, another undocumented immigrant who worked construction, she had lived in the U.S. for nearly 10 years. Together, they built a quiet life. They shared a one-bedroom apartment in a modest building in Delano. On weekends, they bought tamales from a street vendor and went to Mass. When Maria became pregnant, they wept with joy. She planned to name the child Esperanza, hope. Everything changed the morning ICE raided the produce warehouse. Officers stormed in just after 6 a.m. The workers were ordered to drop their tools. Maria stood frozen, a box of strawberries in her arms, as agents shouted names, checked IDs, and zip-tied wrists. She begged in Spanish, "Estoy embarazada, por favor." "I'm pregnant, please." No one responded. She was taken, processed, and placed on a cold bench surrounded by strangers. Roberto searched for her for 3 days, checking hospitals, calling jails, and finally driving to the ICE field office, where no one would confirm she was even in custody. In detention, Maria's physical condition worsened. She struggled to eat the packaged meals and began vomiting frequently. She used her sweater as a pillow. No prenatal vitamins were offered. When she passed out, the other women banged on the door, screaming until a guard finally entered. Maria was limp. Her lips were pale. Still, no ambulance came. She was wheeled into an exam room and left under fluorescent lights. By the time she was released, following public pressure from a local advocacy group, Maria had lost the baby. There was no investigation, no public acknowledgement, no apology. She returned home with empty arms and eyes that no longer met the light. She stopped speaking much after that. According to Roberto, a part of her stayed behind in that place. Maria's story, devastating as it is far from unique. Behind her personal tragedy lies a landscape of hard data and documented failures that paint a damning picture of ICE's treatment of pregnant detainees. Data that has existed for years, often ignored and rarely acted upon. According to a 2023 report by the Government Accountability Office, GAO, more than 1,650 pregnant women were detained by ICE between 2016 and 2021. Despite internal guidelines requiring specialized care and immediate medical assessments, over 39% of those women did not receive a documented prenatal health screening within 24 hours of intake. TRAC, Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, at Syracuse University, further reveals that ICE detention centers have repeatedly failed inspections related to medical services, particularly in rural contract facilities, where staff shortages and undertrained personnel are common. In 2018, ICE formally ended its policy of presumptive release for pregnant detainees, meaning women like Maria could now be held indefinitely pending deportation proceedings. Although the policy was partially reinstated in 2021 under the Biden administration, loopholes remain, especially in privately operated or county-run detention centers where oversight is inconsistent and complaints are rarely escalated. Multiple lawsuits filed by the ACLU and other watchdog organizations cite harrowing accounts of pregnant women forced to endure early labor in holding cells, denied prenatal vitamins, and subjected to unnecessary shackling during transport, despite federal guidelines advising against such practices. In one 2022 case, a woman miscarried in a facility in Georgia while guards reportedly ignored her cries for help. That same year, internal ICE audits documented over 85 instances where medical emergencies involving pregnant detainees were either delayed or never responded to appropriately. And yet, accountability remains elusive. ICE consistently frames these events as isolated incidents. Despite their frequency and repetition, medical care contracts are renewed. Facility operators are rarely penalized. Most notably, the detainees themselves, without citizenship, often without legal representation, lack the voice or platform to demand justice. Even when inspectors issue citations, little changes. In the facility where Maria was held, A 2022 review found insufficient medical staffing to accommodate the needs of vulnerable populations, including pregnant women. No changes were made before her arrival. None have been reported since. These facts raise a larger, more uncomfortable question. In a system so thoroughly documented to be failing, what does it mean to call these incidents accidents? Where does negligence end and cruelty begin? The ethics surrounding ICE's detention of pregnant women like Maria are deeply complex and deeply divisive. On one side, defenders of ICE argue that no person is above immigration law, regardless of circumstance. They cite national sovereignty, border integrity, and the uniform application of legal standards. If we make exceptions, they argue, we erode the rule of law. To them, enforcement must be consistent, impartial, even when it feels harsh. A person overstaying a visa, they say, is still in violation. If Maria wasn't in the country legally, her detention was justified. But ethical logic demands more than legal justification. It demands moral reflection. And this is where ICE's practices begin to unravel. There is a clear difference between enforcing a law and disregarding human dignity in the process. Critics ask, what purpose does it serve to detain a pregnant woman under inhumane conditions when she poses no threat to public safety? Is justice truly being upheld when someone loses a child in custody for want of a basic medical checkup? Does legality override compassion? The Geneva Conventions, standards of humanitarian treatment even in times of war, explicitly prohibit the unnecessary detention of pregnant individuals unless absolutely necessary. Many argue that the U.S., which positions itself as a global human rights leader, is failing to meet even this baseline. Moreover, according to ICE's own guidelines, vulnerable individuals, including pregnant women, should be prioritized for release or placed in alternatives to detention programs. Yet, the real-world application of these standards is inconsistent at best. From a utilitarian view, the costs of such detentions often outweigh the benefits. Detaining pregnant women in facilities not equipped for their care increases risks of medical emergencies, opens the government to lawsuits, and erodes public trust. It also sends a chilling message to immigrant communities. You are not safe, no matter your condition. At the heart of the ethical debate lies a fundamental question. Can a nation that fails to protect its most vulnerable claim to be just? The law may provide a framework, but ethics demand context, nuance, and compassion. Maria's story is not a loophole in the system. It is the system working as designed. That is what makes it so hard to ignore. Because if this is what lawfulness looks like, perhaps it's time to rethink what justice truly means. The consequences of Maria's detention and her subsequent miscarriage rippled far beyond the walls of the ICE facility where it occurred. The trauma wasn't hers alone. It shattered the fragile safety net of her small community in Delano, where many lived in mixed-status households and carried similar fears. Neighbors who once felt cautiously secure now walked with lowered eyes. Parents stopped sending their children to extracurriculars. Attendance at Sunday Mass dropped. Local clinics saw a rise in untreated pregnancies and stress-related ailments among undocumented women too afraid to seek care. Roberto, Maria's partner, struggled to keep his construction job while caring for her in silence. Their apartment grew quieter. The baby items they had slowly saved, a crib from a secondhand store, hand-knit blankets mailed from Oaxaca, a plastic mobile shaped like stars, remained untouched in the corner. She doesn't sleep, he later told a community volunteer. She wakes up in the middle of the night, touching her stomach. It's like she forgets the baby's gone. Advocacy groups began documenting similar cases, amplifying what had once been whispers into public records. A report compiled by a local immigrant rights coalition listed 4 other women in the region who experienced miscarriages while in ICE custody or shortly after release. One was a 19-year-old detained during a traffic stop while en route to a prenatal appointment. Another was a domestic abuse survivor flagged by ICE after filing a protection order. Meanwhile, schools noticed behavioral changes in children whose parents had been detained or deported. Teachers described rising absenteeism and signs of trauma, nightmares, withdrawal, aggression. One 7-year-old student drew a picture of her mother behind bars, holding her belly and crying. The drawing was sent to the principal, then to a social worker, but nothing changed. At the policy level, Maria's story prompted short-lived outrage. A state senator tweeted her concern. A local news segment aired once, then faded into the noise of the next crisis. ICE issued no apology, and no disciplinary actions were taken at the facility. The system moved on. But Maria didn't. Roberto didn't. And their community didn't. The real impact, then, is not just a single woman's tragedy. It's the erosion of safety, the collapse of trust, and the normalization of loss in immigrant communities across the country. When one life is discarded without accountability, the message sent is chillingly clear. Some lives in this system are worth less. There's a quiet kind of violence that doesn't make headlines. It doesn't scream or bleed. It doesn't come from a gunshot or a riot. It comes from indifference, from systems that reduce people to paperwork, that weigh a pregnant woman's suffering against the convenience of bureaucracy and choose silence. Maria's story is not just a policy failure. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, we see not only the cracks in the immigration system, but in ourselves. What does it say about a society that allows a woman to lose her child in custody without even demanding a formal investigation? What kind of justice system watches suffering and calls it a non-life-threatening event? Is it law that makes us civil or compassion? Maria was not a threat. She was a worker, a mother, a believer in second chances. She followed the rules of survival, kept her head down, worked hard, contributed to her community. Yet when she needed protection the most, she was met not with care, but with cold concrete and delayed medical response. There's a dangerous myth that dehumanization only happens in war zones or distant regimes. But in truth, it happens quietly, with memos, with budget cuts, with phrases like standard protocol. It happens when empathy is replaced by procedure, when vulnerable lives become collateral damage for political talking points. But we have choices. The law does not exist in a vacuum. It reflects the values we're willing to fight for. We can choose systems that both protect borders and uphold dignity. We can choose oversight. We can demand that enforcement never mean abandonment. And we can remember that justice without mercy isn't justice at all. It's control. There's also a deeper question that Maria's story raises. What kind of nation do we want to be remembered as? One that locked up the pregnant, the sick, and the voiceless? Or one that paused, looked again, and chose humanity? No child should be lost because of neglect masked as legal procedure. No mother should carry both the weight of loss and the silence of a system that refuses to say her name. Maria's silence is now ours to break. Her grief is now our responsibility to reckon with. Her story is the test, and history is watching. If Maria's story moved you, if it stirred something in your chest that felt like anger or sorrow or even shame, then don't let it end here. Stories like hers don't exist in isolation. They exist because systems are allowed to operate in darkness, because policies are made behind closed doors, because suffering continues when no one speaks. You can do something. Start by sharing this story. Share it widely. Speak Maria's name where ICE would not. Let others know what happened, not as a statistic, but as a human tragedy that could have been prevented. Every time her story is told, it pushes back against the silence that let it happen in the first place. Then, take it a step further. Support local immigrant advocacy organizations. Many work directly with families affected by ICE detention, providing legal aid, medical referrals, and shelter. Donate if you can. Volunteer if you're able. Show up to town halls. Ask your elected officials, what are we doing to protect pregnant women in detention? What oversight exists in our local facilities? Demand transparency, demand accountability, and if you work in healthcare, law, or government, remember the power you hold. Use it. Speak out when protocols violate ethics. Report the failures. Fight for training that centers humanity, because indifference is a choice, and so is courage. Finally, reflect. Ask yourself what kind of community you're helping build. Is it one where fear and silence rule, or one where empathy and justice are non-negotiable? The answer lies not just in Maria's story, but in how you respond to it. History doesn't remember policies. It remembers moments. It remembers the names of those who suffered and the courage of those who refused to look away. Let Maria's story be that moment for you. Don't scroll past. Don't forget. Don't wait. Share her story. Break the silence and take action today.